Good evening, and welcome to our event on the After Party with the Vice President of our Policy Institute, Danny Russel, who is visiting us from our New York headquarters. Let's welcome Danny. This is the 6th of 8 programs of our Seeking Truth Through Facts U.S. China program series. We have hosted events on the CHIPS Act, semiconductors, supply chains, and research collaboration. All of these programs are leading up to our 5th annual Future of U.S. China conference on January 12th. If you want to get your tickets, they're on sale right now at an early bird price, so that's a really good deal. A warm welcome to our chair, Gary Reichel, who is in from Seattle. We have our board members here, our advisory council members, and we have representatives from quite a few consulates. We have representatives from Japan, Korea, Britain, the Philippines, Hong Kong, Taiwan, students from Mills High School, and we have a special group of visitors from the Republic of Korea invited via the State Department as part of an international visitor leadership program. They're sitting in this area. There'll be live translation going on. This is through Global Ties of SF, and we welcome everybody. We are grateful to everyone for your support of our mission of navigating shared futures. I'm Margaret Conley, the Executive Director of our Asia Society Northern California Center, and we are very excited about our program today. Danny's timing is perfect. He's going to talk about China's historic Party Congress, the midterm elections, and the first in-person meeting that's scheduled between Presidents Biden and Xi. And he's going to do all of that in an hour. We're going to wrap at 6:30 Pacific before Danny needs to leave to another meeting. There will be time for Q&A at the end, and when that time comes, please, if you have a question, raise your hand. I'll be calling on folks. If a microphone comes to you, please introduce yourself, and please keep your questions short so that we can get to as many of you as possible. This event is on the record. We are recording, and we're going to post it as soon as possible on our Asia Society Northern California YouTube channel. Please take a moment, everybody, to silence your phones. Danny's full bio is on our website. It is very long and impressive. I'm going to share a few highlights to get us started. Before joining our Policy Institute as Vice President for International Security and Diplomacy, he was a fellow for a year. He is a career member of the Senior Foreign Service at State. He most recently served as Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs. Before that, he was at the White House as Special Assistant to the President and National Security Council's Senior Director for Asia Affairs, and he has been posted in Japan, the Netherlands, Cyprus, and South Korea, among many other places. He is a respected colleague and a friend. Please join me in welcoming Danny Russel.
Thank you so much, Margaret. Thanks, everybody. It's wonderful to be back in the Bay Area, and it's wonderful to see some old friends and some members of the consular community, as well as some of the students. Thank you very much for coming. I'd like to address a couple of questions and then open it up to discussion. And what I want to talk about are a few things like, where are we now in the U.S.-China relationship? What do we think that we learned from the 20th Party Congress that just concluded? What should we expect from China in Xi Jinping's third term? And hardest of all, what should we, Western countries, the United States, what should we do about it? So, in my view, the U.S. and China today find ourselves in what the academics call a security dilemma. Each side feels threatened by the other. Each side is deeply suspicious and convinced that the other side's intentions are hostile. Each side is taking action that it thinks is purely defensive, but that the other side considers to be provocative. This is the sort of victim mentality, the, hey, she kicked me first attitude. In this environment, even a gesture of compromise becomes very politically difficult to offer. To offer compromise, even just civility, opens one to attack, to criticism from within your own side. And if compromises are offered to the other, oftentimes instead of looking like an olive branch, it looks like a Trojan horse, that there's some ulterior motive here. Speaking personally, as a former diplomat, I'm very troubled by the current state of the U.S. China relationship. I think we are in a particularly dangerous moment. I had a long career in government, as some others in this room have had, and there was always a range of opinions in government, a range of opinions in Washington about China. But the views that used to be considered extreme, even the lunatic fringe, super hardline, super hawkish views that were in the minority in the past, today, those convictions in Washington about China and in China about Washington are now in the mainstream, really widely held. And there's pretty close to zero tolerance for self-critical views in either of the two capitals. So the thinking in Washington, the conviction in Washington actually, is that China is actively subverting the global order, the post-war system of rules built around the UN Charter and so on. The view is that China is trying to hijack the global governance system and twist it in a way to privilege China's own national interests, to make the world safe for authoritarianism, they say. And that it's doing this at the expense of not just the United States, not just the West, but at the expense of universal values and legitimate international interests. That China is committing genocide in Xinjiang against its own religious minorities, that it's suppressing legitimate political expression at home, and it's threatening or coercing or co-opting governments in smaller countries. Today, the U.S. national security strategy, the national defense strategies, define China as America's premier challenger, in effect, our preeminent threat. Now, on the other side of the Pacific, the conviction in Beijing about America's intentions and America's policies is, if anything, even more negative, even more suspicious. The official report by the Chinese Communist Party last month to the Party Congress warns about intensifying moves to suppress China, to contain China, moves by hostile forces. I don't think there's a lot of uncertainty about who that refers to. The report complains that China is facing blackmail, blockade, containment, maximum pressure, and it warns that this trend is going to continue and accelerate. China's foreign minister, Wang Yi, who I've known and worked with for many years, and who got a big promotion during the Party Congress and is on track to become China's premier diplomat in the third term. He was recently in New York and gave a talk at the Asia Society that I joined him at. And what he said basically is the U.S. is waging an ideological war against China. The U.S. is attacking China's political system, its development path, its governing party. The U.S. is encircling China, it's containing China, it's building anti-China cliques. It's poisoning China's relations with other countries. He complained that although America had committed back in 1979 to recognize only one China, that in fact the United States was virtually violating the pledge that it made to the PRC when it switched diplomatic relations from Taiwan and is moving towards what's in effect a two-China policy. And that he points to high-level visits by U.S. officials to Taipei, large arms sales by the U.S. to Taiwan. And his accusation is that the United States is encouraging independence, pro-independence forces, what he called splitists, separatists on Taiwan. He complained that the U.S. keeps imposing sanctions and tariffs, embargoes aimed at damaging China's economy, blocking China's technological progress, undercutting its development. And he was being polite, too. So both sides are warning the other that the other is threatening the international environment. Both sides are talking in terms of struggle, resisting, strengthening our defenses, deterring, and in effect even undercutting the other. Now, I don't want you to get me wrong. I am convinced that the West needs to push back against a lot of areas, a lot of behaviors by China. I am convinced that the United States needs to compete, needs to outcompete China. But let's remember the difference between healthy competition and destructive rivalry, right? Competition is what the Phillies and the Astros are doing. Rivalry is what the Crips and the Bloods are doing, right? Competition brings out the best in both sides. Rivalry brings out the worst in both sides. And the flip side of competition is cooperation. But for several years now, the U.S. and China have been unable to cooperate on virtually anything. 2 weeks from now or less, in Egypt, the UN conference on climate change, COP27, is going to be held. But the two biggest emitters in the world aren't talking to each other. They're not working together on climate change. North Korea is on the verge of conducting its 7th nuclear test. You heard it here first. It's coming. Vladimir Putin is threatening the use of tactical nuclear weapons against Ukraine. But our two countries, the U.S. and China, aren't even talking about non-proliferation. We're not talking about preventing the use of nuclear weapons. So the starting point is, let's just say we're not in a good space as Xi Jinping begins his 3rd term. Second question I posed is, what did we think we learned from the 20th Party Congress that just ended? So first of all, in a Leninist system like China's, personnel is tremendously important. And we learned that Xi Jinping is powerful enough to completely sweep the table, as they say, in terms of party positions. He was strong enough to put loyalists in all the positions of power. He dismissed virtually every official who had connections to other factions within the Chinese Communist Party, even those who have served him loyally over the past 10 years. He was strong enough to override the norms and the rules that have governed the party, that the party has put in place over the past 4 decades, including those enacted under Deng Xiaoping, by Deng Xiaoping, expressly to prevent the return of cult of personality, the return of one-man rule in China, and also to ensure an orderly succession. So Xi Jinping blew past a lot of these rules, not just the 2-term limit, not just the refusal to name a successor, but things like the retirement age of 68, things like having women, even a single woman on the Politburo, having at least a modicum of balance among different stakeholders, interest groups, factions within the party. That's now a thing of the past. So I think that the conventional wisdom is that this means that Xi Jinping is so strong that he didn't have to compromise. And that's certainly what it looks like. But it also may be that it was that he wasn't strong enough to compromise, that he didn't feel secure having anybody who wasn't a Xi Jinping partisan as part of his government, as part of the leadership group. In either case, I'm not the first person to point out that when a leader surrounds himself or herself with acolytes, with yes men, then the flow of information becomes distorted. Then decision-making suffers. Okay, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Back to the Party Congress. What else did we learn? So the main theme of the Congress, at least in my view, is struggle and security. Xi Jinping painted a pretty dark picture of China's external environment. He warned that the world is a turbulent place, a dangerous place, filled with hostile forces. And instead of language that we're familiar with from the previous 2+ decades about peace and development being the trend of the times, he instead highlighted that instead of being a period of strategic opportunity, this is a period of struggle, of danger. He said the Chinese Communist Party, the Chinese people have to prepare for the storm. They have to withstand the high winds and the shocking waves, he said. So the messaging at the Party Congress seems designed to prepare the people in China, the party, to batten down the hatches as Xi Jinping steers China through what he describes as these dangerous storms. And of course, implicit in all this is that he, and he alone, is the helmsman who can be trusted to steer China through these turbulent waters. So the shift from hide and bide, the shift from peace and development, leaves me with the sense that in some ways the social contract that the party has with the people in China has changed. Because in the last several decades, party legitimacy seemed to rest on economic performance. The party provided economic prosperity for a growing middle class, and in return, they held a monopoly on political power, okay? So it may not be a coincidence that as growth slows in China and the economy faces headwinds, the party is recasting its claim to legitimacy in terms of nationalism and security in the face of foreign threats. It's been pointed out to me that the word security appears in the work report, the document submitted to the Party Congress, 91 times. And it's not just the word security, it's an expansive definition of security, of comprehensive security, of multidimensional security as the bedrock for national rejuvenation. Security in the sense of indigenous technologies, in the sense of economic self-reliance to make China less vulnerable, say, to international sanctions and pressure. Security in the form of tighter domestic surveillance, more party control, stricter ideological conformity. Security in the sense of an enhanced military, speeding up military modernization with an emphasis on areas where the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, needs to make more urgent progress. Security in the sense of an intensified crackdown on what the party sees as subversion by foreign forces. I'd also just note that the accomplishments that are cited with pride in the work report to the Party Congress match almost one for one the criticisms of China from the West. The handling of Hong Kong with the national security law, the handling of Xinjiang with the Strike Hard campaign, the handling of Taiwan with a pressure campaign, the handling of COVID with zero COVID, the handling of the economy. The party is congratulating itself for success in precisely the areas that most of us would consider its most egregious behavior. All right, so that brings me to the question, what should we expect from Xi Jinping? What should we expect from his third term? First of all, I think it's fair to accept Xi Jinping's judgment that we're in a new era. Fair to accept that China and the world today are undergoing major changes unseen in a century. Okay. The way that it strikes me is that in the Deng Xiaoping area, the motif, the slogan was, to get rich is glorious. Well, in the Xi Jinping era and the new area, it feels like the subtitle under to the times in China today is, to get strong is glorious. And here too, I think we have to ask whether Xi Jinping's push for comprehensive security isn't really reflecting a kind of comprehensive insecurity. And it's worth remembering that paranoia is a fundamental building block for Leninism and for authoritarianism. So I think that there are reasonable grounds to be concerned that this campaign for comprehensive security ultimately may make both China and the world less secure, not more secure. Despite all the changes that I've outlined, the breaking of norms and taboos from the Party Congress, rewriting the party's social compact with the public, my own conclusion is that what we are going to see from Xi Jinping, from China over the next 5 years, is actually a great deal of consistency. Now, there may not be a lot of consolation in that. Consistency in terms of Xi Jinping's goals, his policies, his methods, but likely with a greater intensity, with a greater assertiveness. I think that what we have seen in the last week or so in the Party Congress suggests that we better prepare ourselves for this third term of Xi to be one in which he doubles down rather than dials down on the approaches that he has been taking. We shouldn't expect him to change course. Xi Jinping may have made some tactical retreats from time to time in his first 2 terms, but no real strategic reversals that, at least that I can point to. So I mentioned the reestablishment of one-man rule, the stacking of leadership with acolytes, with proven loyalties. I think that opens Xi Jinping to what you could call the Putin problem or the dictator's dilemma, this classic syndrome that has bedeviled kings and emperors and dictators throughout history. The more absolute their power, the longer their personal rule, the more bias creeps into their information flows, the more distortions, the more flaws in their decision-making. Now, I have seen the argument made that since the people selected by Xi Jinping are clearly people who have proven their loyalty to him, regardless of their qualifications, the new team will have his confidence and therefore should be able to get Xi Jinping to either change his mind on some issues or go along with their professional recommendations. I fear, however, that that is wishful thinking. and that it is much more likely that they were selected by Xi Jinping because she trusted they would follow his orders more than that she trusted their judgment, let alone their judgment over his. And let's face it, people around authoritarian leaders are selected, and they flourish, they survive based on their ability to tell the leader what the leader wants to hear, what will please him, what he already believes. And this is, I think, one of the big risk factors in any authoritarian system. And it is exacerbated by what we have seen in the first and second term, which is a contempt for the bureaucracy, a preference for a more kind of monarchist style of governance centered on himself, the core. Remember that. So he's created leading groups. He is leading these leading groups in almost every aspect of policymaking within the Chinese Communist Party and at the expense of the government. The party has, under Xi Jinping, usurped traditional policymaking by the government, certainly by the ministries. So I think that means that we should expect China's behavior and China's policies in a third term to become more and more a reflection of Xi Jinping's own views and preferences, with even less of a capacity for self-correction. The flip side of his recruitment of loyalists is his purge of veteran economic technocrats and market-oriented members of the party who have experience with foreign investors, with businesses, with governments. People like Liu He, the vice premier, the kind of economy czar. People like Yi Gang, the head of the central bank. I won't go through the list, but the fact is that the outgoing crowd, the people who have been dropped from the Central Committee or the Politburo, includes a lot of really respected and well-known veterans with track records, with demonstrated competence in finance and the economy. And that, generally speaking, it looks like they're being replaced with a new economic team that has a lot less experience, certainly on the national level, let alone internationally. And it seems like they're being replaced with people not who have distinguished themselves as technocrats, but who will unswervingly implement Xi Jinping's vision of economic nationalism, of technological nationalism. And the result is, I think we should expect economic policies in Xi Jinping's third term to reflect a further tightening of party and state control, with even less room for private entrepreneurship and a greater prioritization of ideology over economics. Now, I've mentioned struggle. I've mentioned comprehensive security. We should also probably pay attention to the promotion of an unusual number of party members from the defense industry in China and with backgrounds in military science or in defense-related technologies. I'm also told that this is the first time in the PRC's history that the head of the secret police, the Ministry of State Security, was given a seat on the Politburo. And by the same token, on the diplomatic side of the equation, it's probably no accident that two leading wolf warriors, so to speak, received big promotions. Foreign Minister Wang Yi, who I mentioned, and Chinese ambassador to the United States, Qin Gang, both promoted. But thinking about Xi Jinping's third term, we need to keep in mind not just the outcomes of the party Congress, but also the formidable challenges that he faces today and in the next 5 years. On the domestic side, There's the urgent challenge of avoiding the middle income trap by moving Chinese manufacturing up the value chain, by improving economic growth. There's de-risking and deleveraging the financial sector and its staggering debt loads. And very much intimately related to that is the real estate and housing crisis. And related to the real estate problem is the need, more broadly, to rebalance the economy towards consumption, which is badly suppressed by the zero COVID policy that Xi Jinping seems committed to. And not necessarily for all the wrong reasons, certainly because of an inadequate public health and social service system. There's the serious problem of youth unemployment, and that's a problem against the backdrop of China's demographics, a population that's growing old before it grows rich. There's fallout from Xi Jinping's crackdown on the tech sector, on entrepreneurs, policies that have put a chill on private sector activity and investment. Bear in mind that Xi Jinping's technology push is at the heart of both his economic strategy and his security strategy. But it's facing pretty serious headwinds right now. Now, I haven't lived for a long time in China. I know a lot of people. I visited frequently, and I'm not for one moment underestimating the brilliance of Chinese scientists, of Chinese engineers. Their innovative power is extraordinary. But look at some of the anomalies. Look at the result of the crash campaign to develop an mRNA vaccine. We're still waiting. Look at the push for indigenous semiconductor design and production. Beijing poured tens of billions of dollars into that campaign, and not only has it fallen short when it comes to semiconductor design and production, but now Beijing's investigating where all that money went. So there clearly are problems. And to top it off, the U.S. has now imposed very significant, maybe crippling export controls on semiconductors, on the design equipment, even on what American personnel can do in China in this sector. In the coming 5 years, the Chinese government's going to continue to struggle to ensure food security, and that's exacerbated by Russia's war against Ukraine. It's going to deal with or struggle to deal with serious water security concerns. So there's pollution problems of the earth, of the water, of the air in China. And on top of that, Beijing has made very significant decarbonization promises that we want the government to keep, but would be very expensive to actually implement. That's on the domestic side. Externally, as I've mentioned, the party is emphasizing the extraordinary, unprecedented challenges that China faces. Now, Beijing attributes all these challenges to evil foreign actors and doesn't seem to take any responsibility for the problems. But nevertheless, these are challenges that Xi Jinping is going to face in his third term. The new normal for China is very substantial international pushback, not only from the United States, not only from Japan or from Australia, but from the West and beyond generally. And while in the developing world, attitudes towards China are not nearly as negative and are positive in some respects, there's definitely trouble ahead because of the massive debt held by China in the world's poorest countries. You know, countries that were poster children for China's Belt and Road Initiative, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Zambia. These countries are on the edge or over the edge of bankruptcy. And given the global economic slowdown, the devastating effects of COVID in the global south, China's push for repayment or repayment in the form of natural resources and mining concessions for those nations that can't repay in currency, that's being called out as exploitative, as a kind of form of neocolonialism by some of these countries. Now, from the perspective of the Chinese Communist Party, maybe the most worrisome thing of all is that Taiwan, the Taiwan issue appears from Beijing's perspective to be trending the wrong way, with the United States and others in the international community getting more involved with attitudes in Taiwan towards unification, hardening. So I am not somebody who believes that the leadership in Beijing has a defined timeline for subjugating Taiwan, other than the sort of repeated assertion that unification of the nation is a prerequisite for national rejuvenation, which is tied to the centennial of the Chinese Communist Party, 2049. I happen to believe that for a lot of reasons, Beijing would prefer not to attempt to seize Taiwan by force, that it would win without fighting if it could, that its strategy is a little more of the, I don't know, boa constrictor than it is the rattlesnake. But I also believe that what Xi Jinping fears is being the Chinese leader who lost Taiwan. That he cannot, he believes, allow Taiwan to move towards independence or allow the United States to move to a one China, one Taiwan policy. And I have no doubt that Xi Jinping would take huge risks, including war, all-out war, if he believed that would prevent this from happening, if he thought that the red line had been crossed. So in thinking about Xi Jinping's third term, we should recognize that the handling of the Taiwan issue looms particularly large, particularly given the Taiwan election slated for a little over a year from now. All right. Last, what should we do about it? I'm going to be brief, not just because time is running out, but because there are no easy answers to this question. The simple fact is that the United States and China, whether we like it or not, are marooned together on planet Earth. Our challenge is to find a way to coexist on terms that both of us can accept without blowing up planet Earth. Now, I happen to believe, I may not be totally objective, but I happen to believe that the Biden team got it basically right when it stated early on that America's China policy would be guided by the three C's: compete, confront, cooperate. That construct was very familiar to me, having worked in the Obama administration. There were areas where the interests of the U.S. and China converged, and it made sense to both of us to cooperate. There were areas where we were in direct cooperation, and our goal certainly was to make the competition fair. There were areas where we really disagreed, where our interests really diverged, and where we couldn't solve the problems, we at least tried to discuss them. We tried to narrow them if that was possible, or if worse came to worse, at least tried to manage them so they didn't destabilize the entire relationship, so that the differences that we had on one issue didn't preclude the possibility of cooperation in other areas. But that was then, and this is now. And as they say in New England, at least, you can't get there from here. We cannot get back to that relationship, certainly not easily. Because as I said, right now, we're trapped in a security dilemma. So how could the downward spiral of strategic rivalry and mutual trust be slowed, be halted, be reversed? The very first rule I learned when I joined the State Department is when you find yourself in a hole, stop digging. There is no problem that is so bad that you can't make it worse. So we have to think carefully about what we do and what we say. Right now, our most urgent priority is avoiding a crisis. And maybe tied for first place would be managing a crisis if it occurs. Both sides have a responsibility to build safeguards, to reduce risks. And that's very difficult to accomplish in the current atmosphere. The Biden administration again and again has advocated for the development of some safeguards, some guardrails in the U.S. China relationship. And the Chinese side has made clear that it worries that these kinds of guardrails, these safeguards between the militaries would just have the effect of emboldening the U.S. Navy, the U.S. Air Force to do things around China's periphery that Beijing wants the U.S. to stop doing. So we're kind of stuck. But we simply can't afford to stay stuck given the existential risk of conflict between the U.S. and China. The second big point is that as major powers, both countries have an obligation to set aside, to exempt what are really global emergencies and exempt them from the gridlock that locks down the rest of our relationship. So would we work together? Would Washington and Beijing work together if there was an alien invasion, right? Would we work together if there was a meteor heading towards Earth? You kind of hope so. Well, there are here and now dangers, the equivalent of the alien invasion, threatening Earth right now. And the U.S. and China fumbled the chance to work together against a virulent pandemic. And we're not doing so well in dealing with another big threat, the threat of climate change either. Working together is hard, but we're learning that working against each other is even harder, and it's much more dangerous. So it's urgent that we take a step back from the edge and that we each try to manage the relationship more responsibly. Now, President Biden and President Xi Jinping, although it is not yet scheduled or announced, at least have a chance to meet in person 2 weeks from now in Bali when they're both there for the G20 summit. I happened to be a fly on the wall in the meetings that the two of them had beginning in 2011 as the two vice presidents. And I was able to sit in on many of the, or maybe all of the meetings that they had in over the next 5 years or so. And what I saw is that they got to know each other to a degree that's actually quite rare between world leaders. And I came to feel that they had a strong relationship, that they understood one another pretty well and that they were able to communicate pretty openly. Now, one meeting between leaders isn't going to turn things around. It's not going to end the security dilemma. It's not going to end strategic rivalry, but we don't have a whole lot else going for us. So I think this may, in fact, be the best chance that we have to at least check the dangerous downward spiral that we are in. So fingers crossed. Why don't I stop here, Margaret, and see what other people have to say. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Let's give him a round. Thank you, Danny. We do have time for questions, so if you have one, raise your hand and please introduce yourself. We'll start on that side of the room there, and then we'll go to Peter over here.
Excuse me. Thank you. Hi, David Lurch. I had a question about calibrating sanctions and your thoughts generally on sanctions policy, specifically Carrie Lam and Hong Kong. I mean, I think that given how the sanctions were initially enacted in response to the extradition law in Hong Kong, and I think given her position with protesters, also vis-a-vis the extradition law, and her response to the extradition law and her general positions that she's taken in Hong Kong, and the fact that she's no longer in power. I mean, I think that it makes sense from both the standpoint of the U.S. and also China to take her off the sanction list,
Okay.
and if that's a starting point.
So in international relations, sanctions can be an expression of frustration. Sanctions can be a symbol of outrage. Sanctions can be a tool used to try to influence policy, or it can be a deterrent against future actions by the same or by other parties. But the sanctions imposed as in response to the imposition of the national security law in Hong Kong might be a combination of all of those things. There are some downsides to sanctions, and the two areas of particular concern are one, that sanctions, if excessively applied, like medicine, can create negative antibodies, can build up the resistance in a system, and can cause, in this case, policymakers, whether it's in Hong Kong or Beijing, to behave in exactly the way that we don't want. Or in the case of sanctions imposed against tech sectors in China, can accelerate the drive for indigenous self-sufficiency, and may ultimately lead to leapfrogging technologies and outcomes that are the opposite of what is intended. The second pitfall, and I'm sure there are many more in sanctions, if there is no off-ramp, there is no exit. If you're just punishing someone, if you're just expressing your anger, maybe you don't need an off-ramp. But if what you're trying to do is to influence behavior, you really want to construct your response in an if-then equation, because you want the person or the government to understand that if they do this or stop doing that, then the situation will get better. And it's difficult to see thus far whether it's Carrie Lam, whether it's John Law, whether it's Hong Kong, or whether it's some other aspect of Chinese behavior, that sanctions are being applied in a way that indicates the remedy or an off-ramp.
Thanks. Peter Michelson of Stanford University. You mentioned the upcoming possible meeting at the G20 between Xi Jinping and President Biden. What would you hope would be, or might expect would be, a step forward, even one thing that would come out of that meeting that would signify progress? I have an idea myself, but I want to, hopefully they would agree to keep talking going forward.
Well, I'll crib your idea, Peter, and call it my own. And not merely that the two leaders keep talking, but that they vest with real authority in a trusted aide, whoever that is, the responsibility for tackling the most urgent problem in the U.S.-China relationship, which is the lack of any kind of crisis prevention, crisis management conduit. In 2001, a Chinese fighter pilot intercepted a U.S. surveillance plane unprofessionally and unfortunately, causing him to crash and die, and causing the reconnaissance flight to make a forced landing on Hainan Island. And this was early in the George W. Bush-Jiang Zemin relationship. It took something like 10 or 11 days of intense diplomacy to resolve that issue satisfactorily. It was hugely politically charged, very dangerous. It's hard to imagine what would happen if a similar incident occurred. And it could occur today because the number of military assets moving in close proximity at high velocity all around the South China Sea, the East China Sea, and particularly the Taiwan Strait is so great and so dangerous. So it's not just the leaders talking. And I'd make a big distinction between dialogue that is more of a debate, where they're talking at each other, and a serious engagement, whether it's a negotiation or an exploration. But I can say with confidence that absent a clear directive from the two leaders to their teams to engage in that process, it's not going to happen. So I agree with you. I think that's one very specific and concrete outcome that we should hope for.
More questions? Let's go right there. And then the second one up in the front row.
My name is Philip Bui. My question here for you is, Xi will be in power at least for the next 5 years, right? And for us, maybe in 2 years, we have a new president. This is just a hypothetical question. What happened, or do you think it will be better for U.S. and China relation if suddenly, for the God's sake, Xi die or Putin dies? So do you think there will be a chance for the relation to improve?
It's a little bit like putting your life savings on the roulette wheel. You don't know what you're going to get. I don't think that's an answerable question. What would happen in the aftermath of a disabling or the death of China's leader is a huge problem for China, and by extension, a huge problem for the world. I'm not an expert, but I have certainly read and been told that in authoritarian systems, there is a tendency first for the system to coalesce in the event of a sudden death of a leader like Stalin, for example. So I'm told we shouldn't expect an immediate chaos or disarray. The Chinese party is a very coherent entity and would surely come together in some fashion. But that typically, historically, it leads to power struggles within the party. But how that would end, nobody knows. So the mission at hand is to deal with China as it is. And China as it is led very forcefully by Xi Jinping. His father was long-lived. I take it as an article of faith that he enjoys the best health care of anybody in the People's Republic of China. And although Hu Jintao is probably not a great example, given the bizarre denouement at the party Congress. Hu Jintao is alive and kicking, Jiang Zemin even. So there's every reason to imagine that Xi Jinping is going to be around for 1 or 2 decades, if not more.
Question in the front row here. Microphone's coming.
Tazu Luisi. How does Xi Jinping plan to develop his economy with his attempt to crack down on billionaires and individual profit? So Xi Jinping appears to be anti-competition within the Chinese economy, but pro-competition outside of the Chinese economy on the world stage. So how is he planning on competing with countries like Japan, Taiwan, the United States, where workers are motivated by their own self-interest to do their best work?
Well, it seems to be that he's planning to rely on industrial policy, and that he believes that the regulatory crackdown that he has pursued against both entrepreneurs and more broadly the tech sector is working and will work to China's advantage by diverting money that is being concentrated and used frivolously in the hands of a few, and more than a few, Chinese billionaires, and putting that money to work in ways that the party prioritizes, including in poverty alleviation and so on. And also that he would rather have a tech sector in which people like you, instead of working on frivolous computer games, were concentrating on quantum computing. We're concentrating on aerospace. We're concentrating on cutting-edge technologies. And I believe he thinks that he is redirecting China towards technological competitiveness in these critical areas. There is a temptation to deal with the caricature of China. And the reality is that these are very smart people who think they know what they're doing. The party leaders have, I believe, an ideology that is causing them to make mistakes and decisions that, at least from where I stand, don't appear to be in China's best interests. The results are less than sterling. I mentioned a few areas where they've failed so far, surprisingly and unfortunately, in technological development. And when you look at the list of economic challenges that I mentioned, everything from the housing market to the debt crisis, to the lack of effective tax policy, there are what seem to be problems galore. Nevertheless, predictions of China's economic collapse have proven premature again and again. The Chinese system has a talent for muddling through. And notwithstanding the fact that this new crowd of senior cadre don't seem very impressive in their economic credentials, there's no shortage of expertise and no shortage of talent in Beijing.
Last question, Chris Cooper.
Thank you again for coming. What's your view on the peak China theory that, Hal Brands and I think Michael Beckley have been talking about? And you talked about the 3 Cs in Washington, and I hear different theories as to how the peak China principle is playing out in Washington. I'd be curious about your view on that.
I'm not an IR specialist, so I am less perhaps entranced with these sorts of constructs. But I mean, to me, taking a step back, the issue is really, do you believe that structural forces are the ultimate determinant of the future of nations? Or do you believe that human agency is a critical factor that can dramatically alter the course of events? Now, there are a lot of structural forces at work, it goes without saying, in China and other countries. But what I've experienced in my career dealing with China, and particularly working on China and on U.S.-Asia policy in the transition from Hu Jintao's second term to Xi Jinping's first 2 terms, is how hugely impactful change of leadership is. And particularly when you have a highly motivated and a, let's just say, self-confident leader who also has the skill set to accrue phenomenal power and to engineer radical change. I'm just not comfortable with theories that are sort of rooted in kind of inexorable structural forces leading China to a particular future.
Thank you very much to Danny Russell.
Thank you, Margaret.